Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today from the great state of Texas is my friend and frequent partner in crime, Neil Chatelain. Neil, how are you today?
Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing well, very well. Thank you very much. So I reached out to Neil because recently I was in Pensacola, Florida, and I went out to Fort Pickens for the first time. And I was like, geez, this is a pretty cool site. Never been there before. Who do I know that knows something about Fort Pickens that I can just poke their brain a little bit and ask some questions? And Neil was the drawer of the short straw there. So thanks, Neil.
Absolutely. I'm good hope.
uh, Fort Pickens really played a key, if undersung, role in the very, very, very early days of the war and some Navy involvement. And so that's why I thought Neil would actually be a good person to talk about this, since he is a great Navy guy. And first of all, just your impressions of going out to Fort Pickens.
Yeah, so like just some baselines there. Fort Pickens is just one of those standard post artillery forts built in that third tier system, after the War of 1812. And it's one of three forts that was built to protect Pensacola. The others are Fort McRee and Fort Barrancas. Um, and it's basically kind of like Mobile Bay. There's a spit on two ends, and then there's a fort in the middle, kind of forming this triangle into Pensacola Bay itself. And Pickens is the eastern fort. It's the hardest one to get to, just because it takes a while to get there. There's no bridges really. You kind of have to go the long way around to find your way there, but it's pretty well preserved for the most part. They got your standard stuff, the cannons and all the cool stuff like that that people like to see. But it's the biggest one sort of protecting Pensacola Harbor, so to speak.
So, and when I went out there recently, it's part of Gulf Shores National Seashore, and it's kind of in its own little unit out there on the end of the spit. And like you said, I had to go out and around and then come in, and then pay $20 to go to the fort for like an hour and a half, which maybe was a little more than I wanted to pay, but I wanted to see Fort Pickens, so I did it. And then you have to drive 25 miles an hour to get out there. Really neat dune ecology. They've got some short coastal forest ecology that's there. So if you're interested in, kind of that ecological stuff, fascinating stuff. But then I got to the fort, and there are many layers of fort. Now, you say it kind of dates back to the post 1812 era. But then there are also some World War II fortifications and things like that along there too. Um, why is this an area that just kind of kept getting fortified and fortified and fortified?
It's all about just Pensacola has a deep water anchorage. I mean, it's one of the few deep water anchorages in the Gulf that's readily accessible on the coastline. There's Ship Island, Mississippi, there's Mobile Bay, and Galveston, and that's kind of the big picture. Like people say things like, "Oh, Key West has a deep water anchorage," but it's not as deep as you would think. You can't get a ship with a 20-foot draft into Key West, but you can get something like that into Pensacola. And right from the very beginning, the United States recognizes this. I mean, there's a Navy Yard in Pensacola, there's a dry dock in Pensacola. Everybody always talks about the dry dock at the Gosport Navy Yard near Norfolk being the only one the Confederates have. Well, they have a dry dock in Pensacola as well. They just can't use it because they can't get ships out of Pensacola because the United States keep control of Pickens. But this deep water anchorage and then some shipbuilding facilities is what facilitates Pensacola as a key position. And it's not just the Civil War, like you mentioned, just like a lot of other coastal forts, it's retrofitted for the Spanish American War, World War One, and even as late as World War Two. They've got coastal fortifications and coastal watchtowers and things like that, looking for U-boats. And so it's remained a major position, and uh, even today, it's still a major position because the Pensacola Naval Air Station is right there. And so this has always been a military heavy area, and it's always been a heavily fortified area for the United States of America.
You mentioned the air base. Folks probably have heard of the Blue Angels, that great Air Force squadron that shows off in so many great ceremonial capacities. They're based in Pensacola. Hmm.
They're based in Pensacola, and one of those three forts, the Fort Barrancas one, it's literally right there at the Naval Air Station now. They're like right on top of each other. So the old Navy Yard is essentially where the Navy Air Station is today. So it's kind of cool history that it's still the same location, roughly speaking.
Wow. And I realized I probably just used the wrong terminology when I talked about that air squadron. I don't know if squadron is the right word there or not, but I
I
see.
mean, Air Squadron, yeah, but Air Force Squadron, no.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. They are a Navy group, right? Yeah, see, look at that. See, Zed. That's why I need your help, Neil. That's why I need your help. Having seen them in like perform in person, though, it's an extraordinary,
Oh yeah, it's something
extraordinary
to see.
group of air folks there, air people, airmen. What's the proper term there?
Naval aviators would be
See,
the
look at that.
proper term.
See, that's again, that's why I needed your help today, Neil.
Get the vocabulary lesson for an hour.
See, I'm that slow. It might take that long. So.
That's all right.
So as I walked around Fort Pickens, and we'll kind of talk about the history of it in a second, but when I walked around Fort Pickens, obviously being right on the Gulf, the ocean, the weather, erosion, it's taken its toll on these fortifications. So they definitely feel like ruins rather than, like if you were to go into Fort Morgan at Mobile Bay, which still feels like a big, solid, massive, ready to go fort. Fort Pickens felt like ruins to me.
And it's a problem that a lot of Civil War era fortifications face. It's just that a lot of I mean, they're coastal fortifications, which means they're on the coastline. A lot of them are on barrier islands. I mean, this is on essentially a spit that's the equivalent of a barrier island for Pensacola. And it's one of many that over the years it's just been deteriorated. I mean, there are examples like, I mean, Fort Fisher is a state site in North Carolina. It's half gone. It's been decimated just because of erosion. Fort Wagner in South Carolina. I mean, these are earthen forts, but like Morris Island's not even really there. That whole part's underwater. There's a bunch of forts in coastal Louisiana that have essentially just been abandoned by the state and just left to be there, and you can't access them anymore, really. And it's just this common theme of the coastal part of the Civil War is becoming more inaccessible for people just because of the nature of where those locations are. And so it's hard to get to them, or just because of erosion and things like that, hurricanes and whatnot, uh, it's expensive to rebuild those things, and they don't really want to because the cost doesn't outweigh the benefit of how much tourism they're going to get in the long
Right.
run. And so viewing these sites can be difficult, and viewing them as they appeared at the time to really understand why they're important is impossible in a lot of situations.
Yeah. One of the other things I noticed about the ruins, part of the fort actually exploded in an accident. There had been a fire there. Fire hits the magazine powder, which they're not able to evacuate, and just blows a huge chunk of the wall away. And they actually have that preserved, so and they tell that story there. But it's like, wow, a reminder that it's not just war that takes its toll on these structures, but just I guess the regular wear and tear of occupying them and using them comes with hazards as well.
And some of the forts have really good preserved powder magazines. I know like Fort Warren and Boston Harbor, their powder magazine is pristine. It looks exactly like it kind of looked at the time. But it's kind of neat that you have one where, no, this is what happens when it blows up. And you can kind of see the other end of that spectrum a little bit.
Yeah. So let's walk through the early history of Fort Pickens as it relates to those early days of the Civil War, because uh, it's intimately tied to the story of Fort Sumter, although a lot of people don't realize it. What's going on, during the Buchanan administration? There's a lot of question about what to do with any U.S. installations. Fort Pickens, one of a number that suddenly find itself in what becomes hostile territory as states begin to secede. Lay that picture out for us for a second.
Yeah, so as each state began to secede, and in some cases before they even seceded, people were debating openly, does U.S. federal government property revert back to state control? What's the jurisdiction for all these things? And as states began seceding, they began seizing these fortifications one by one. In some cases, they were assaulted or taken over before the state had even seceded. People were still having debates in the secession conventions about it, and militia would just show up and be like, "It's our fort now. It belongs to this state now," or whatnot.
Well,
Um,
and that was something that happened over at Fort Morgan, as I recall. Like
yeah,
troops from
exactly. Yeah.
from Florida went over to try to basically force them to capitulate and force Alabama's secession hand.
Yeah, and the tricky part is that a lot of these fortifications are not heavily manned. I mean, the U.S. Army is small, only 17,000 people-ish, and most of the majority of that is on the frontier or out west beyond the Mississippi River. And so, there are examples where some of these forts, I think one of the ones in Louisiana has like two people. It wasn't Castle Pinckney had one person
Yeah.
assigned to it at the time, and he just lived there with his wife, just making sure that stores didn't fall apart while they were there, like all the supplies. And so some of these fortifications are very lightly armed or not manned very well. And so it's very easy for people to just move in with a company of militia and just raise a flag and now it's theirs. Um, Pickens, however, is different. It's one of the fortifications the United States doesn't give up. So when all the secession happens, ultimately four fortifications that are in Confederate territory do not get abandoned by the United States, and those four are Fort Monroe up in Norfolk, Virginia area, Hampton Roads. You've got Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, Fort Zachary Taylor in Key West, and Fort Pickens in Pensacola. So three of the four in Florida, which is kind of interesting. And they don't get abandoned by the United States. It's basically these are the fallback positions that everyone tries to keep control, just like Fort Sumter was, except Sumter capitulates after the bombardment. But you're right, Pickens and Sumter are very much linked in a lot of ways, and a lot of people speculate that if a peaceful resolution at Sumter would have been made, then they would have just started shooting everyone at Fort Pickens a couple days later anyway, because it kind of almost happened in that situation anyway.
And there's a mix up about kind of who's getting supplied and who's getting reinforced and all that. So, in some ways, a little bit of a comedy of errors turns Sumter into kind of the default anyway. Um, we'll get into that in just a second, but so as I start turning into Sumter, as they start turning into Fort Pickens, there's a lot of debate and discussion in the Lincoln administration about what to do about these things. President Lincoln doesn't want to give up these federal installations. That's basically then admitting defeat before anything's ever happened. Um, but there's a lot of different opinions in his cabinet about this. Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of where do the camps fall and what are the different options that everyone is arguing over? And this is at that real team of rivals stage early on in the Lincoln administration. I mean, he's only a couple weeks old by the time all this happens. And so nobody's really learned how to work with each other yet. And so there's a lot of tension in this cabinet as part of these discussions.
Lincoln takes office, he does his inauguration, and then the very first letter on his desk is a letter from Robert Anderson saying, like, we've only got so many supplies and we're running out, and what are you going to do about it, basically? And that's the very first thing that he has to do as president is, like, it is the national attention. And you're right that his cabinet, they're not really quite sure where their role is in all of this. Navy Secretary Gideon Wells is just trying to figure out what's going on. Um, William Seward is kind of trying to put feelers out on a power play of, am I going to be the man behind the scenes dominating Lincoln? Because he's just this guy from the West who doesn't even, like, he had to teach himself how to read, he doesn't know what he's doing, sort of an idea. And then Lincoln's pushing back on a lot of people with trying to make decisions to prove that he's kind of in control of the situation. And the options are either abandon these positions and de facto leave them to the Confederacy, or try to reinforce them with military forces, and that could trigger a war, or try to just reinforce them with supplies, food, and whatnot, to try to keep the status quo, to keep negotiations going, because some Southerners are just appearing in Washington D.C. every now and then, saying that they'll mediate the whole crisis single-handedly. There's the political factors are pretty significant. Um, and the result of all this is that a couple of people go to Lincoln with options. Um, One group goes to Lincoln, and that's sort of the Gideon Wells category. And it's not even him, it's just the guy who ultimately becomes his assistant Navy Secretary, Gustavus Fox. He's an old naval officer who retired and went into business, and now he just shows up. He's got money. He's kind of prominent in politics. He just shows up to Lincoln and he's like, "I have the plan to save Fort Sumter. We need these ships. Give me 4 ships." And give me 1 ship full of supplies, and I will go to Fort Sumter myself, and we'll run these supplies and troops in if we have to. Um, and then there's a secondary group that's meeting, and that group is comprised of William Seward trying to do the puppet strings in the background, and he's got the support of future Admiral David Dixon Porter, who's just a lieutenant at the time, and Montgomery Meigs, who was just a captain or something at the time, because nobody's been promoted yet. And they come up with this top secret plan to do basically the same thing at Fort Pickens. Charter a merchant ship, load it with supplies and soldiers, send it to Pensacola, and the Navy will escort it in safely. And Lincoln approves both plans. The trick is he approves the same ship to go to both places. And that
And
ship
he
is
doesn't tell one group about the other either, as I recall.
no, it's even crazier. Yeah, they're not sure. Seward is not sure he can trust anyone in the cabinet, that he can trust anyone in the Navy, and so the Navy Department doesn't know that they're making plans to use Navy Department ships, and so the Navy, when they make their plans for Sumter, assigns the same ship, USS Powhatan. It's a modern sort of gunboat, steam-powered gunboat. It's got a lot of heavy artillery on it. It's got numerous steam launches, smaller boats that can ferry troops and supplies in and out. So this is kind of the make or break situation. If you want to reinforce a fort, would you rather have a ship that has 10 rowboats and a couple of boats that are powered by steam engines, or would you rather have 2 rowboats? So this is a ship big enough to carry supplies and people in quickly, and it has the artillery to sort of back the oomph up to make sure that people are doing what they're doing.
And I think kind of also an important consideration here is that both of these plans call for chartering a merchant ship to carry the supply. So it's really framed as a humanitarian mission that we're just going to bring in food and water so that these men don't starve and they don't die of thirst. But this is not a military operation. The military is just there to escort what should just be a humanitarian effort. But if the Confederates pick a fight, well, we just happen to have some naval vessels available for that. Why is that an important frame for Lincoln at this stage of the negotiations?
I mean, it's all about he doesn't want to be framed as starting the war. So if it's we're reinforcing with food, well, who can fault a man for providing food to the people under his care? But the second you send soldiers with guns, all of a sudden it's, oh, you're trying to provoke a war. And so he wants to be seen as the guy who is providing humanitarian assistance to starving soldiers on the frontier of what's going on, instead of being seen as this guy who's trying to coerce the southern states into starting this entire operation. And it almost nearly started a couple months before with the whole Star of the West incident, when the Citadel's cadets fired on a civilian ship going to Charleston to try to deliver food. And it was turned away because it didn't have any weapons on it. And when it got fired on, they turned it away. What's weird is the same thing happened at Fort Pickens the same time. In January of 61, a U.S. Navy ship, USS Brooklyn, was sent to Pensacola. And it's sent there to deliver soldiers. It's not just sent there to deliver food. It's ferrying a company of U.S. artillery to help man the fortifications. Um, and that brings up a big difference between Charleston and Pensacola. It's the Navy is there. The Navy Yard is there in Pensacola. There is no Navy Yard in Charleston. There is no U.S. Navy base in Charleston, but in Pensacola there is. When Brooklyn shows up and anchors outside of Pensacola, there are 3 other warships there already, because that's just where they're stationed at. One's a giant sailing frigate, USS Sabine. It's got 50 cannons on it. And the other 2 are smaller. But the point is, there's a Navy yard, there's a dry dock. There are already ships there guarding. And when Brooklyn anchors off of Fort Pickens in January 61, the ship has orders to drop off all these soldiers. Well, they just don't, and the soldiers just spend the next 3 months on Brooklyn, the ship, waiting for confirmation that they're going to go ashore, and they never kind of quite do it. And so it's kind of in limbo because, you know, if they do it a month later, now it's violating whatever de facto truce that they have with these Confederate guys about, okay, we're not going to reinforce. They're here, but we're not going to do anything. And so it becomes very much the same kind of political situation of, do we reinforce with people? Do we reinforce with food? Because the original decision was send soldiers to Pickens, and then the on-scene commanders didn't actually deliver the soldiers, and they wouldn't be delivered until April of 61.
And it's probably important to note that these guys, they're on the ships, but it's not like, stinking, awful, filthy conditions where they're starving and stuff. Like they're getting supplies ferried back and forth from the Navy Yard, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean they got the Navy Yard there, and then there's still Key West is in U.S. control. They're getting regular foodstuffs. The only problem is one of the ships, their water condenser starts breaking during that time period, and so there's a question of, are we going to have enough fresh water for everybody? But it proves to not be the deciding factor in everything.
One of the things that I find really curious about this whole stage of the situation is that there's just a lot of negotiation going on. And like, Anderson cooped up with his men, he's still able to send messages through the lines,
Mm.
South Carolinians let messages go, like they want to talk, they want to try to find some way to break this impasse. So there's, when you talk about the cadets from the Citadel firing on the supply ship, it's like, oh no, 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 wait, 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 we didn't mean that. And so there's everyone's really trying to keep this from really reaching that point. Modern audiences might think that's a little peculiar, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, yes, but also in a way, they know that whoever draws the line in the sand is going to be the one where the gun starts shooting, and then that one dude is going to get the blame for starting everything. And so people on scene are like, yeah, let Robert Anderson send some mail, or yeah, let the guy on the ship send a message to the Navy Yard or to the Fort Pickens or something like that. Um, what's the harm in sending a letter to the president? Because he could be sending a note that says, "We don't have anything left. We got to surrender. What are you going to do about it?" Um, and so there's a lot of formality, but then it's also a pocket in everybody. It's in everybody's back pocket of, well, but if you're not negotiating the way we want, we're going to impound your mail, or we're going to not let you buy supplies, or we're going to suddenly erect those batteries we said we wouldn't. And so, there's negotiations, but the negotiations are also subtly, and if things start going sour, we're going to make it a lot more uncomfortable for you.
Yeah. And even that was sort of a big line to cross. You didn't read someone else's mail. And so for at least the early phases of these negotiations, mail's going unimpeded. And finally Confederates are like, yeah, maybe we should start reading this stuff. And then they're able to sort of exert that kind of subtle pressure that you're talking about there. How would you characterize the situation at Pickens versus the situation at Sumter during, this period through March and into early April?
Sumter definitely has it has the press, it has the power, it has the oomph. It's the place that everybody's looking at. People are not really looking at Fort Pickens so much. And I don't know if that's because Pensacola's deemed not as important as Charleston, or just because Fort Sumter's location in the center of the harbor makes it seem more prominent, or it could be something as simple as Robert Anderson's a major in the U.S. Army. The guy in charge of Fort Pickens, his name is Slemmer in January of 1861. He's a lieutenant, so maybe it's just people don't care about him as much. Um, or it could be that Sumter is kind of surrounded and doesn't have support, whereas Pickens, the Southerners know that, well, they've got all these giant ships with 50 cannons on them that are going to start shooting if we start shooting. And so this is a much less even, it's a much more even fight that we might lose. And so Southerners focus a lot more on Sumter. And the Lincoln administration ends up focusing a lot more on Sumter, though, to be fair, relief expeditions are sent to both forts simultaneously, and that's the whole mix-up of the same ship at both places at the same time, which is a ridiculous story of the nuances of it are crazy, and it's worth going over at some point. But like so Lincoln's dealing with both at the same time. Southerners kind of have their eye on Sumter because I think they can win there.
Hmm. And kind of again thinking about the crazy little layers here, and you mentioned command at Fort Pickens, and there was a fella, last name is Chase, I can't remember his first name, who'd been in charge of the garrison, leaves the garrison, and then becomes in charge of the Florida militia that then threatens to lay siege to Fort Pickens. So here's someone who knows literally the insides and outs of the situation there. And then he gets his bluff called. It's like, you're not going to attack here. You're going to cost you too many men. That to me seems like a really weird personal dynamic on the ground.
Yeah, and there's questions about like the guy in charge of the Navy. Or he ultimately also resigns and joins the Confederacy, and people are questioning, is he loyal? And what's he going to do? Is he just going to turn the yard over to the Confederates, which they do get possession of it after hostilities start and everything? So there's a big back and forth of who do you trust? Who's actually going to follow through with what they say they're going to do? And then, the whole who's actually got orders to do what, because we're not quite sure because everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else at the same time. So the political situation certainly impacts the results of the military naval situation 100% in this particular case.
Yeah. Yeah, and you've mentioned that idea of we don't know who trusts who and some of that. And I want to kind of go back to on the northern side, um, David Dixon Porter and Gideon Wells, who have not yet figured out how to work with each other, and their relationship obviously is going to be central to winning the war eventually. Um, Porter is pretty skeptical of Wells at this point, as I recall.
I mean, well, Porter. I mean, he's politically connected. He's low ranking. He's old for a lieutenant in the Navy. But he has he comes from a Navy family. He's very politically connected. The day South Carolina secedes, he's in the White House talking to James Buchanan, trying to figure out what's going on. So he's got some serious connections, and Gideon Wells also has significant political connections. That's how he ends up in the cabinet. But it's not the relationship that you're going to have 2 years later with everybody trusting David Dixon Porter to do things at Vicksburg and just make it happen with Ulysses Grant. It's the opposite. It's who do we trust and who's actually in charge, and they find themselves on opposite ends. Porter is part of the let's figure out how to fix Pickens group, and Gideon Wells is taking favor on the let's relieve Fort Sumter group. And the result is that Wells doesn't actually know where Porter is, and he ends up in command of a ship that he's not supposed to be in charge of, going to a place that he's not supposed to be going to in the eyes of Gideon Wells. And so it causes some serious angst. And then the only reason that Porter's kind of forgiven for all that is because Seward essentially tells Wells that he came up with everything and all the blame should go to him. And he co-opted this naval officer guy. And so don't blame that guy.
So, and Seward, like he's kind of running roughshod at this point. You mentioned about he's trying to position himself as the power behind the throne. Like one of his legitimate ideas in this period is to start a war with Britain or Spain, and that gives the U.S. a common enemy, and so the South and the North would come back together to fight this common. And like that seems to me to be ridiculous. Probably not far-fetched for anybody who reads a lot of fiction, but like it seems ridiculous, and yet it's a legitimate part of what Seward's up to at this point.
And it's taken seriously by a lot of people just because almost to the point of they're hoping something like that happens. Like it's something to unite the country before it splits itself permanently. And so people who are desperate for a solution, you've got negotiators in DC, Congress is trying to pass new amendments and come up with the Crittenden Compromise and everything at the last minute. And Seward's walking around. Let's just start a war with somebody else, and let's get all this let's fight each other energy out of us. And a lot of people are just throwing it away like, oh, that's trash. Why would we do that? But enough people are thinking about it where all of a sudden it's a viable potential, and that just makes European people freak out too.
And we should probably add that it's not the only time during the war that someone comes up with that idea. One of the peace proposals toward the end of the war is like, why don't we just join forces and fight the French in Mexico. So like that idea of a common enemy to unite a very ununited folks at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth bringing up. Didn't most Confederates consider themselves American, just Confederate American all of a sudden? So, like, this idea of America versus Europe is still there, even if it's two countries instead of one, so to speak.
Yeah. So we've got two separate missions, one going to Sumter, one going to Pickens. Same boat is supposed to be escorting both of them. How does this finally come to light that there's been some awful mix up?
The mix-up, it gets figured out on April 5th, 1861. USS Powhatan is in New York Harbor. It's at the New York Navy Yard, and the captain of the New York Navy Yard, a guy you know, his name's Andrew Foote, the guy who ends up commanding all the ironclads on the Mississippi River. He has orders, he gets notes. Prepare the ship for this mission to go to Fort Sumter. Prepare the ship with this mission to go to Fort Pickens. And he basically telegraphs Gideon Wells and he's like, which order do I prepare the ship for? And that's how Gideon Wells figures out what's going on. And on the night of April 5th, Wells goes to the White House with Seward, and basically they all discuss it with Lincoln, and it comes out, holy cow, I've sent the ship to both places. And they send a note back to New York saying, send the USS Powhatan to Fort Sumter. The note arrives at like 3 p.m. on April 6th. USS Powhatan went to sea at 2 p.m. on April 6th. And when it went to sea, the orders sending it to Fort Pickens said, get rid of the captain of USS Powhatan, this guy named Captain Samuel Mercer, and replace him with David Dixon Porter. Since he made the plan, he's going to be in charge. And the telegraph message saying stop the ship, send it to Sumter instead, actually said, all right, fire Porter and put Mercer back in charge of the ship. So Foote sends a tugboat hurrying down New York Harbor through the Narrows and everything to try and catch up with Powhatan. It does catch up with Powhatan. The tugboat delivers the note. David Dixon Porter doesn't go with the note because he has handwritten orders signed by Abraham Lincoln to go to Pensacola, Florida. And the note saying, no, you're going to Fort Sumter instead is signed by William Seward. And he says, well, the president trumps the Secretary of State. We're going to Pensacola. And he just leaves. And so it heads to Pensacola, not to Fort Sumter. The folks heading to Fort Sumter on the relief expedition there, their orders are go off Charleston Harbor, and Powhatan will rendezvous with you there. And it never shows up. They're literally waiting for the ship to show up before they try and go into Fort Sumter, and it's on its way to Pensacola. And to make it even dumber, April 6th, the day that it leaves to go to Pensacola, the U.S. Navy sends a guy to Pensacola. His name is John Warden. He's the guy who ends up commanding USS Monitor in 1862 in the battle against Virginia. He gets sent to Pensacola with a note, one of these deliver the mail notes to go tell the fort and to go tell the Navy there that not that Powhatan is coming with a relief expedition. It's orders to reinforce the original order of landing those artillerymen from USS Brooklyn to go into Pensacola, into Fort Pickens. And he's allowed to just go into the U.S. lines. Braxton Bragg interrogates him, and he's like, I'm here to deliver a message. And Braxton Bragg, in charge of the Confederate dudes there, says, all right, go deliver your message. And he basically reorders everybody on USS Brooklyn land and reinforce Fort Pickens. And then he leaves, and all this is happening at the same time that Sumter's being bombarded. So Warden arrives in Pensacola April 12th or April 11th. The soldiers, Company A, for Battery A, 1st U.S. Artillery, lands in Fort Pickens on April 12th. 110 U.S. Marines from all those warships at Pensacola go into Fort Pickens as well. And then on April 13th, Warden leaves to go back north. And on April 14th, he gets arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, and he basically becomes one of the first prisoners of war. He's held for 7 months by the Confederacy. because hostilities have commenced and now he's an enemy, sort of a thing. So as Fort Sumter's being bombarded April 12th, U.S. military and naval forces are landing in Fort Pickens simultaneously. It's not the relief expedition sent yet, it's the original reinforcement force finally getting off their butts, so to speak. Um, but then the bombardment of Sumter happens. Powhatan isn't even there to help land the forces, the soldiers of the relief expedition sent to Pensacola. The merchant ship sent carrying soldiers gets there and lands on April 15th, and then Powhatan doesn't arrive until April 16th. And so all the soldiers are already in Pensacola. So sending it essentially proved pointless because the other Navy ships were already guarding the same location. So, in the grand scheme of, looking at retrospectives, Powhatan would have done more good at Charleston, and it was not really put to effect at Pensacola at all. But then that starts the hypothetical of, well, if that ship was at Charleston, would they have tried to push in the reinforcements? And now the Navy is bombarding Confederate coastal fortifications while landing soldiers, and Fort Sumter's siege, the 2 day siege, turns into a much bigger and probably bloodier fiasco.
Mhm. So, so your contention then is that if the Powhatan had been at Charleston, that doesn't just turn into sort of what's essentially a show. It turns into an actual thing.
I know Gustavus Fox. I mean, he's very aggressive, um, and he was determined to see this through. And if he would have had that ship, he would have tried to go in. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Now let's pretend that folks in Pensacola don't know that something's going on in Charleston. So as the Navy is landing the troops, there's now a military buildup at Fort Pickens. What are the options on the ground for the North and the South at that moment?
Yeah. So, the United States is trying to just reinforce Pickens. They've lost the other forts, and they're about to lose the Navy Yard just because it's exposed and surrounded. And they're just trying to maintain a status quo here. And so my gut tells me that they're probably just going to try to keep pushing for that status quo. I mean, the U.S. Navy has ships there, and the ships are old. They're not the best ships, but they do have gigantic ships, and nobody's going to try and attack them with rowboats. There are no armed gunboats in Pensacola for the Confederates at that point. And so it's essentially, as long as the U.S. Navy is there, Fort Pickens isn't going to have anything happen to it in a grand scheme. Now, the Confederates, their options are either pull some sort of negotiation ploy or threaten to bombard Pickens, which then they have to follow through if they're going to. Um, but it's very much the same predicament that Charleston's in, but it's a much more favorable predicament for the United States. And the proof in the pudding on that is that Fort Pickens doesn't surrender. It never surrenders. It remains in U.S. control for the rest of the war. And that's even after, in October 61, the Confederate Army, under Braxton Bragg, attacks the fort and tries to capture it, and they're repulsed because the U.S. Navy has ships there bombarding the Confederate landing parties as they try to get close to storming the forts. And so it remains in U.S. hands, and that's kind of the nutshell of it is that it's something that the United States is able to maintain control of, despite the same threats that happen in Charleston.
And why is it that come October, Bragg finally decides, like, hey, we better assault this place? Why, I mean, and why does he wait that long to do it?
I think it's a matter of the United States Navy is preoccupied elsewhere. So the Navy, the force that's at Pensacola becomes the core of what turns into the Gulf blockading squadron before it gets split up into the Eastern and Western Gulf blockading squadrons. And right at, May 1861, a bunch of those ships are ordered to Mobile and to the mouth of the Mississippi River. By October 1861, the U.S. Navy is being ordered to go into the Mississippi River to build a fortification and evaluate building a fort at the head of passes where all the channels converge at the mouth of the river where the Birdfoot Delta meets together. And the U.S. Navy's kind of preoccupied trying to figure out all of that because the squadron commander's already been fired for not doing it fast enough and he got replaced. And so the new guy is like, that's the priority. We're going to do that, the Mississippi River stuff. And so when the Confederates attack It's called the Battle of Santa Rosa Island. It's right before the Confederates launch a counterattack in the Mississippi River with their own ships. But they launched this attack essentially because they think that the U.S. Navy is gone, and ships show up kind of at the last minute to stop it.
Huh.
Basically because ships are going back and forth ferrying guns and supplies and messages, and so from the Mississippi River to Pensacola, and so because they're asking for cannons, and where are you going to get the cannons from? It's either Pensacola, Key West, or the Dry Tortugas. And so, like, there's a lot of internal U.S. military naval negotiations happening over whose cannons, how many, all that stuff. And as the Confederates see the ships coming and going, they see them going, and they're like, oh, well, there's only one or zero ships today. Now's our chance. And then ships come back with more messages for the fort commander, and they're like, oh, the fort's under attack. We might as well help out. And so they're there to defend us kind of at the last minute.
Yeah. And that's kind of it for Fort Pickens then. I mean, they just basically stay in Union control. Why is it people don't know about that Battle of Santa Rosa Island, particularly at a time where the Union's looking for some good news?
Nobody knows about it because, I mean, like, nobody got killed. Very light casualties. The total number of people involved are like a couple hundred. It's very much the equivalent of like a Blackburn's Ford sort of situation. There's just not, the numbers are not there. And then when does the United States hear about this? Well, the ships have to send messages back by ship up to New York or Philadelphia or DC or Virginia, Hampton Roads area that they're in control of, kind of. And that takes a couple of weeks, and now all of a sudden it's November. And what happened in November, or is word is also arriving of the U.S. Navy's defeat at the head of passes. And what really foreshadows all this is that in November, the U.S. Navy also gains control of Port Royal off of South Carolina's coast. And that's the huge victory. That's the real first newspaper headlines everywhere. Massive U.S. victory. The Navy's doing something. And so, the Santa Rosa Fort Pickens thing just sort of falls to the wayside as just a skirmish that didn't matter. Whereas, Port Royal, they're making it happen. This is it.
Yeah.
The first real big victory, and we forts are surrendering to us all of a sudden now, sort of a thing.
So, what are the implications for both sides that the Federals maintain control of Fort Pickens for the rest of the war?
Uh, the biggest thing is that it determines who controls Pensacola. Um, in March 1862, all of a sudden Braxton Bragg gets orders to bring most of his troops up to Tennessee, and they eventually form an element of the Army of Tennessee, just like soldiers were ordered up from New Orleans at the same time after the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson fiasco for the Confederates. Leaves Pensacola very lightly defended. And then when word reaches Pensacola that New Orleans has surrendered in April, they basically, all the Confederate military people go, oh, they're going to come here next. And they just abandon Pensacola because they don't feel like they have the capability of taking Fort Pickens. So they just abandon the whole city. And the United States sees Confederates leaving, and they go, ah, we get our city back now. And so Pensacola is now back in U.S. hands around May 1862, and it stays completely in U.S. hands for the rest of the war. Not a lot of rail connections or anything like that, so the Confederates aren't losing a lot of infrastructure. There's not a lot of factories there. They didn't really put the Navy Yard to use, so the Confederates are not losing much per se in losing Pensacola. But the United States gains a lot when they get all that back. So having Fort Pickens kind of like keeps the thread in the needle um, to the point where when they get control of Pensacola back, all of a sudden Pensacola, well, there's a Navy Yard there and it's already ready to go. And it's got the facilities. We just need to resupply it. And the Pensacola Navy Yard becomes a major resupply base and a major repair facility for the Gulf blockading squadrons for the rest of the war. So Key West, it's the same thing in Key West. That's why having Key West in the U.S. hands for the war is critical. It's because it helps keep the blockade in place, especially in 1861 when there's nowhere else for ships to go. So, like if Key West and Fort Pickens weren't there, ships in 1861 and 1862, if they want resupplies, they have to go to New York. So, this is critical locations, and it may not seem like it if you're looking at a map from an Army point of view, but from a Navy point of view, these prove critical for the supporting infrastructure of keeping this blockade and then pushing through to create those coastal assaults like against New Orleans and against Mobile and everything later on that prove very beneficial.
I think too about just sort of the psychological benefits that go with possessing Pensacola. I mean, Florida is one of the most virulently secessionist states. When South Carolina says we're quitting, who's with us? Florida is the only one that's like, yes, we're with you right away. Um, it's one of two states that doesn't have its capital fall during the war, and yet there's this constant cankerous Union presence at a really strategically important point in the state, which has just got to be a needle in the side of Florida's state government.
I mean, having Key West stay in U.S. control is a thorn. I mean, Stephen Mallory, the Confederate Navy Secretary, lives in Key West, and the Confederates don't control the city that he's from. So that's an embarrassment. Having Fort Pickens is an embarrassment for the Confederates that they can't get it. They try to, and it doesn't work out. So it's a thorn in their side, and it's not a thorn that's going to pinprick outward as long as the Confederates don't bother it. Essentially, Pickens doesn't bother them. But just having the U.S. keep Pickens deprives the Confederates from being able to use Pensacola as a viable port. And so you don't hear a lot of blockade runners going through Pensacola. It doesn't really happen. The records are just ships didn't go there because they don't want to run past a federal fort. And it's the very first city blockaded because when the war starts, there are already ships blockading it de facto. Um, and so it doesn't do anything for the Confederacy. And so that makes it even more embarrassing for them.
So, Neil, as we wrap up, any final thoughts you'd like to pass on to our listeners about Fort Pickens, its place in the story, its spot as a park to visit?
Yeah, it's a cool place to go see. It's worth doing if you have the time to devote to go out and see it. I know some of the other fortifications in that area and the Mobile area, Pensacola area are easier to see and find and get to. But it's definitely an interesting one, and it's interesting because of these ties to how the war starts. Fort Pickens is kind of where the war started in a sense because it and Fort Sumter are completely linked in what happens. And they're linked because it's the same situation, and they're linked because the United States takes the same response to both. And it's very interesting because the results are two different results for the same action.
Great. Neil, thanks for spending some time helping me sort through what I thought was a pretty cool site and trying to figure out exactly what happened there. So thank you, man.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.